Good evening and welcome to Associated Black Charities Equity at Work webinar series. We are so excited every single month to bring this webinar series to you as we attempt to support Black professionals in navigating structural racism and the different ways that it shows up in the workplace. We also love these webinars because it gives our allies an opportunity to know about some of the things that hinder success and thriving for Black professionals in workplaces and to make intentional decisions about how they will show up in those same workplaces to be more inclusive. So tonight, I am so excited that our topic of discussion is cultivating allyship. And we know that allyship is all about social justice and activism and advocacy. It is about intentional advocacy for others' rights, for actively working to dismantle the oppressive structures that keep certain marginalized groups of people from being successful. But there are some differing opinions as to whether or not the Black community should be so reliant on the concept of allyship in workplaces, or whether or not it's the Black community's responsibility to cultivate that allyship. And today I am so excited that ABC has the privilege of hosting two career professionals who are really renowned for their expertise in diversity, equity, inclusion, and all of the things related to equity. And I'm going to ask our panelists to join me on screen at this time. I will tell you all that are watching live, and those of you who are going to be watching the playback, we always have a lot of people watch the playback. This is a treat. You may not know it yet. This is a super treat for all of us. We have both Dr. Jasmine Lee with us and Marissa Stone. And if you are in the greater Baltimore region or beyond, you know both of them for their expertise around equity. And I'm excited to learn tonight, to listen more than I talk. And I want to give both of them the opportunity not only to introduce themselves, but to talk a little bit about why they felt this conversation around cultivating allyship was important for us this evening. And we'll start with Marissa.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Chrissy and Associated Black Charities for providing this platform for us to have these real discussions. You know, I've been doing this work since the early 90s when we called it diversity work and cultural competency, right? And so, you know, we've come a long way, you know, looking at, you know, what I call race, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because I think that it's important for us to include, you know, the dynamic of race and DEI. And so, you know, I think about, you know, allyship, you know, I think about, you know, this is change work, and change work is going to present resistance, right? And so whether you're working, you know, in a corporation, or if you're, you know, doing social entrepreneurship work, I think it's important for us to, you know, take a look at that. You know, in my work, I do, you know, organizational culture assessments, which I'll talk about, you know, for many years. And I, you know, one of the things that I think that is important to recognize that, you know, our success as Black people in organizations, you know, has less to do with our skills, knowledge, and ability, and more to do with our ability to identify and to negotiate the culture, and our ability to identify and to negotiate racism.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you so much for giving of yourself and your time tonight. And now we would love to know a little bit more about Dr. Jasmine Lee.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Chrissy, thanks so much for having me. Marissa, I'm so grateful to be in this conversation with you all. So my name's Jasmine Lee. I use she and her pronouns. I currently serve as the Vice President for Equity and Inclusive Excellence at Goucher College. Things that you should know about me as I'm going through this conversation, a couple of things. I'm from the state of Michigan, and so how I think about and experience race is very Midwestern. I think it's important for you to also understand. I've been doing this work not as long. I've been doing the work since about 2009, and so and coming into this space with a kind of a background and a lens from the field of social work. So I'm a social worker by training, and so I think a lot about relationships between communities and systems and people and power and privilege and all of that. And I think the other thing that's important for folks to know about me as I'm kind of going through this conversation is that what brings me into this work is a commitment to dismantling systems of oppression, but more importantly is like a deep passion and interest for creating a world that we all deserve. And so when I'm thinking about allyship and why it's important, it's because I actually see a future, a liberated future where all of us exist. And so that means that when I get there, I want to see people who look like me and people who don't look like me. And so allyship then is necessary, is required. I also am excited to have this conversation because I think often about allyship as a foot in the door or as a point in a direction. It is the beginning of the game. It's not the end of it. And so I'm also just excited to kind of talk about what we do after we decide, that we have committed to a life of allyship. What does that mean the next day, in the long-term kind of game of it all? And then the other thing I'll say why I'm really excited to have this conversation is because I have really benefited from allies, mentors, and sponsors who have not been Black. And so I know firsthand the importance of having relationships with skin folk and with kinfolk, right? And all kinfolk and skin folk. And so I'm just excited to be here, excited to have this conversation. And that's a little bit about me.
This is so exciting, and I can't wait to see where the conversation goes. But I want to encourage those of you who are participating to share your insights into the chat. Make sure that when you are giving insights that you're chatting with everyone in the chat to share some of your experiences. And Dr. Lee Rose, well, Jasmine, she gave me permission, Jasmine, lifted something very important, and that is that she has been has benefited from non-Black sponsorship, mentorship, allyship. If that's your experience, we'd love to hear that in the chat too, because we want to make sure that you all are connected to the conversation. But let's start at ground zero. I hate making assumptions about whether or not we have common vocabulary, whether everyone has some of the same understandings about terminology. So let's talk about what allyship is. I gave a little bit of a nod to what it is earlier. When I looked it up, the research says that it is a concept rooted in solidarity, advocacy, and support specifically for underrepresented groups. And then it gave four components: education and awareness, that, to be an ally, you have to be willing to participate in those things. Amplification, that you're using your privilege to amplify the voices of others. Advocacy and action, right? This is allyship is an action word, right? It's not just who you are, it's what you do. And then listening and learning, that you are, as an ally, someone who prioritizes listening to the needs and not speaking on behalf of, but listening so that you can advocate and allow people the space to speak for themselves. When you hear allyship, what does that bring to mind to either of you? What is your definition of allyship and how it shows up for you?
Very much, in alignment with what you just shared. I think about, the situations and workplaces that I've been in my career. I started at the University of Maryland at College Park, and I was recruited to do change management work. And change management work is not easy work. But during that time, it was the early 90s, and it was a very different time.
Mhm.
And I remember going to a conference at MIT. It was called Black Women in the Academy, Defending Our Name. Had all the powerhouses there, Bell Hooks and Lonnie Grenier and, so on and so forth. And I came back and I really wanted to lock my hair. Now, this may not sound like a big deal right now, but in the early 90s, no one really had locks, especially in professional settings. And my director at the time, who was a white woman, I came to her, I went to her and I said, I really want to, lock my hair and I don't want to lose my job because I have very much a public facing job. I was a speaker, I was a lecturer, and I went and met with government officials and I said to her, I said, I'm just going to be honest with you and I'm going to come to you with this, up front. And she said to me, she looked me straight in my face and she said, Marissa, when you're dynamic, you can do anything you want. And
Mm.
she was an ally for me in that space where, I wasn't even, confident about, what I was going to do and the change that I was going to bring to this landscape. And so, I've had, people that don't look like me, that really supported the work that I'm doing and the vision that I had, and also, how I showed up in the workplace.
And Dr. Lee?
Yeah, I think I would agree actually with the definitions that you offered. Oftentimes when I talk about or think about some of the ways that people talk about allyship, they don't often actually include this kind of advocacy and action piece. And so I was actually really excited to kind of see you include that in the definition. Oftentimes people see allyship as a passive movement, right? Like a lot of times in conversations with students, I use the example of that black box, you recall, some years ago. I think it was in response to George Floyd's murder, and there was kind of an upswell and kind of re-engagement with this conversation around racism in 2020. And on social media, there was a call to like put up a black box. And so
Oh,
everybody,
yeah.
you remember that black box? And
Yes.
that was us allegedly standing in allyship with this kind of racial movement calling attention to. What was interesting about that movement is that as a result, there were all of these think pieces that came out that talked about actually that attempt kind of usurped other movements, distracted our attention from other things and all this kind of stuff, right? But what I find interesting about that is that we decided that just putting a black box up was actually enough, right? And so for me, oftentimes when I hear allyship, that's what I hear, like the bare minimum, a black box, like something that we can do to say, we stand in solidarity. This is important to me, but I'm probably not going to put too much at risk. I'm probably not going to give up too much of my privilege, that kind of a thing. And so the fact that you have a focus on advocacy is really exciting to me. The other thing that I'll say, because I tend to speak in metaphor, is that Beverly Tatum, who was the president down at Spelman for some time, she did a talk where she kind of gave this quote where she describes racism as a moving walkway and like a people mover at the airport, and you just kind of stand on it and you're moving in a direction. You don't even have to be moving yourself. Because it
It's just
moves,
part of
right?
the system, right?
And so she kind of says like systems of racism move without you. And we're all on the moving walkway regardless. We're on it. And sometimes it's not enough to just turn around, right? Like I'm moving in the opposite direction, which is kind of how I think of allyship
Mm.
sometimes. It's not enough to just turn around because the system is still moving. What she says is that you have to turn around and run full speed, right? Like you have to run as fast as you can with all of your power, all of your might, and all of your resources in the opposite direction, knowing that the system is still moving. And so when I'm thinking about allyship, that's also what I'm thinking about, like turning and running as fast as you can with all of your power, resources, right, and privilege in the opposite direction of this thing that is still moving. So it's also acknowledging that the system is still going to perpetuate itself. It's going to evolve to maintain power. And so then how we then are running in the opposite direction matters. So
Mm.
those are the thoughts I'm having. Yeah.
I absolutely love that. I'm going to steal that. I'm going to repeat that somewhere, and I'll remember to give you the proper credit.
Okay.
But that was amazing, an amazing analogy. And I want to stop here because I wonder, this is our definition of allyship. Certainly, it is the formal definition of allyship as well. But I wonder in other communities and white communities how much, allyship is equated to just not being racist, not being hateful, not being, someone who is against Black people. And, is that allyship?
Mhm. I think also, folks don't always understand this lexicon, this language, in my work, I always try to start with race literacy because, these terms mean different things to different people and people experience them in a different way, right? And so, oftentimes, white people, or even our own people, don't understand how they are forcing the very things that we're trying to disrupt, right? Because it's infused in us. And when I think about allies, I'm not just thinking about white people, right? It's really important to recognize, that, we are working in community and, oftentimes we're infused with this hierarchical power dynamic, right? That can help to, move a movement or, or it could, resist it, if you will.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think, you know, I think niceness is should be expected. I think niceness should be expected for all humans. I don't think that that should be owned by anything but the fact that we are blood. Like we bleed, right? Like we're humans, and so I think we do all deserve niceness and kindness. So no, being nice is not allyship in my opinion. Like being nice to people because they're different from you is a bare minimum that we should all learn in kindergarten or at home when we're 3 years old. Racism, excuse me, operating an allyship in a system of racialized oppression requires more than niceness, because sometimes it's going to actually require you not to be nice to your peers and colleagues who are
Family
creating
members. Yeah.
hostile communities and environments.
I think
Yeah.
that's important. And I think that has to be said because I think well-intentioned people don't know that. I don't think we talk about that quite enough. But the next thing I specifically wanted to talk about is why it is so important for Black professionals to consider allyship as necessary, specifically in the workplace. You know, there are different frames of thought, and not because we don't know, like we know there's structural racism. We know that we're not always evaluated by our performance and our capability. We know those things, right? Like we grow up knowing those things before we get into the workplace. It's very, something that we step into very conscious of. But I've observed over a year of doing these webinars that a lot of our allies show up and they're having these epiphanies, right? Like listening to us talk as if these things are not common knowledge to them, that these structures exist and that the lack of opportunities exist. So I would love for us to delve into why, specifically in a workplace, it's so important for a Black professional to seek out and to gain allyship.
Well, I think that, it's important for us to start with just understanding that, we try to stay safe in these workplaces, right? It's only been for the last, I was saying, doing this work, to be quite honest with you, maybe, excuse me, the last 5 or 6 years. I'm so sorry. The past 5 or 6 years, where being able to talk about issues of race in the workplace, has been acceptable, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And even at that, I remember, right after the George Floyd was executed, all these organizations that I had been working with in the past around, diversity and inclusion, et cetera, were reaching out. They were like, we're not really prepared to have these conversations, right? And the Black folks were calling me saying, look, we're not ready. They're not ready, right? I'm going to keep my head down. I'm going to stay safe, right? We know how to stay safe in these organizations, right? And so it became offensive because, we understood that it was dangerous. And, we created all of these committees, if you will, around, diversity and inclusion, that many of them became what I call the Racial Justice Roadshow, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's important for us to recognize that I come from, equity shows up in our pockets, right? And so we have a lot of these performative, initiatives around, having what we call courageous conversations, which, have been in many cases kind of, taken from us, right? We talk about safe space. Well, this work is not necessarily, safe, if you will. So I think that it's important for us to recognize that, when trust is high, communication is high. And when trust is low, communication is low. And so how do you, have honest conversations in environments that may not feel safe for us?
That's a great point. Great point. Jasmine?
Yeah. So the question was why do Black people need allyship in the workplace, right?
Yeah. Why is it a thing?
Yeah, why is it a thing? I think it's a thing for a lot of reasons, and I want to offer two different perspectives, one for Black people and then one from Black people. And so the first one for Black people, a couple of things. One, I think fundamentally it honors how we move through the world, right? Like most communities of color are communalistic and we thrive in community, right? And so I think that allyship, the idea around allyship, honors that we are collectivistic communities, that we move and succeed based on the relationships that we build, right? Adrienne Marie Brown says that. She says our survival is based on the relationships that we build, right? Like we won't even survive without meaningful relationships. And so I think allyship is embedded in that in and of itself. And then when you add the layer of racial oppression, experiences of inequity, generationally, and not just inequity financially, but inequity around just knowing the rules of the system, like how to play the game, what language is, how you're supposed to wear your hair, right? Like all of that stuff is introduced as a part of the process. And so having really meaningful, intentional allies can help introduce us to maybe some of the barriers and introduce us to the cheat codes to get around and over them. I think really intentional allies also say, here are some of the consequences of choices that you can make, and you still should be empowered to make them because you deserve some place where you can live and work as your full authentic self, right? And so I think meaningful allies do that. The other reason I want to say that allyship is really important, because I don't think it's important for us to only think about how we benefit from allyship from non-Black folks. I'm also thinking about the ways that we actually need to show up as allies, as co-conspirators, as accomplices with people who are in our community who don't share our identities, right? I think often about how Black folks, we create exclusionary spaces across socioeconomic lines, around gender lines, around sexuality, around religion, around hometown, right? I can just keep listing all the things.
Absolutely.
And so then we actually are creating harmful and exclusionary environments for people who look like us and are not showing up in allyship. And in particular, because I have, been formally educated and all this kind of stuff, I have all of these degrees, then I take seriously also this idea that I can be stuck up here in this ivory tower having no idea what's actually happening for communities that of people who look like me. And so then I need to be operating in allyship in that way and using my privilege, my power, my seat at the table to leverage resources back around and outside into multiple communities. And so that is an allyship behavior that I need to commit to, even as a Black person.
Yes, absolutely. And that's so important. I think, as I was doing research on this topic and really thinking about allyship and how people might think about it, there's more than one frame of thought. We're here saying that we understand that power and privilege necessitate allyship for us to survive, be safe, thrive, have advancement. But there's, some frames of thinking that are rooted deeply in self-reliance, self-determination. Why should we have to rely on people who don't look like us or people who have privilege to extend it to us? Why should we have to ask for it, beg for it, all these things, right? I heard someone who I respect deeply and really understand deeply say, some people are looking for emancipation while others are looking to build a better plantation. So when you think
Absolutely.
about that, and that, like, when I think about that, it really checked my spirit on like where I stand on the, on the spectrum of that. But there are parts of our community that have hesitations around allyship, right? Like there is no trust. Their relationships don't exist. They don't want to be in a position to have to cultivate what we feel like we should naturally have extended to us. What do you think about that? Those hesitations and that different frame of thought.
Well, I can, share with you directly, Chrissy. I created a social enterprise, Living Well, some years ago. And, one of the things that, prompted me to do that was my experience working for a national funder as a funder and also working in the academy, right? And I saw that, the policies were like, that oppressive policies were just baked into the system. And I wanted to come out and say, I wanted to do community development on my own terms for my community, right? And, one of the things that I didn't want to do was take money from funders because I knew that I was going to have to,
Toe the
you
line.
I was going to have to toe the line. And I just did not, I can't, I was a funder, like, you know what I mean? I had that power position. I understood how the game was played. So I wanted to kind of, change the rubric. And so we had some good experiences and we also had some very bad experiences, right? Where we had to kind of get people together. It's like, look, our community, has decided that, this is what we need and this is how we need it. And we, would appreciate your support. But if we can't have it, we understand that. You know what I mean? No shade. We just, wanted to move on, but it's very hard because you want to survive, right? And so you have to, like you said, you have to toe the line. You have to play the game.
And I think too, as I consider like my lived experience with allies, and I have certainly had them, those that look like me, those that don't look like me. But I've had some situations with allyship that haven't been, I think, at the end of the day, so genuine. I think they have in some cases been misguided. I've felt like in certain situations, like someone's a little token pet, right? Like that they were advocating for because I was the chosen one, but not that you would be advocating for me and my community and other people that look like me, but that, I was the one that kind of made it through to your advocacy. And so I think there is that like fear of tokenism. There's the fear of being used. There's a fear of, advocacy being temporary, like how long can we count on your allyship? Can we count on it as long as that the going is easy, right? Like when you start to face the consequences of using your privilege, does it end there? And there are all of these questions that I think people are asking, who may be a little bit hesitant. And then I'm sure there are allies, people who are good-natured people who can use their privilege, but who are fearful on that side as well of extending themselves to communities because they just don't have to. And so one of the questions in the chat is, for those who are fearful, how can you even just begin to kind of dive into being an ally or wanting allyship?
Yeah. So can I just respond really quickly to something else that you said that
Please.
something you said just brought up for me. What you were just talking about made me think of interest convergence. And interest convergence is this idea where, well, I'll say how I have come to understand interest convergence is when in the context and the framework of critical race theory, and it talks about kind of throughout history, there are these moments where interests converge. And so it kind of like, to use Brown v. Board of Education as an example, the argument is like, they didn't actually desegregate schools to benefit people, Black kids, white kids, anybody, no kids in school. They actually desegregated schools because images of children marching and being sprayed with water and going to jail, being attacked by dogs, started to go international. And we just can't actually have that. And so our interests have now converged. So y'all are going to get what you want because we need, the news to settle. And so that's what we want. And so I do think that doesn't feel good. It also got us to a place, right, where we needed to be. Maybe, people have arguments about whether or not desegregation was a good idea. That's not what we're here to talk about, though. And so I guess I say that to say, I have also had some experiences with allyship that I think I learned pretty quickly were not altruistic.
Mm-hmm.
And then it became about interest convergence. Okay, then, if you're going to get something out of this, how do I position myself to also get the things that I need out of this relationship as well, right? Like if this is going to be a using situation, let's both use each other up then, right? Like, and I mean that in the best way possible.
Right, absolutely.
Especially recognizing that in some ways, like whether it's work or school or whatever, some of that is temporary. And so getting what you need while you're there, based on whoever powers at play, if they're willing to stand in temporary support, then I think there is something to be said about that. I also think for me, that's why I tend to think that allyship is not quite enough, because it feels like the allyship is something that people can step away from if they want to, as opposed to, I trust that you're on my team. Like we're in cahoots together. We're on the same page. We're reading from the same book, right? So that means even when it gets difficult, like the ways that people are saying right now on LinkedIn, like, you're so quiet, nobody's saying anything, right? Like, you're actually on my team, so you don't need to say anything because I actually know you're doing the work, right? As opposed to allyship starts with performance. It starts with symbolism. Look at me being an ally, which actually doesn't change much, right? And so for me, that's the challenge that I have with allyship sometimes, is that it gives too much permission to be wishy-washy. Now, back to the other question, though, about if you're a little bit unsure, how do you get started around allyship conversations and things like that? I would just share with you, I was raised, I was going to say this is not about being Black, but it is. I was raised very Black Christian. And I mean, fundamentalist, traditional, very Black Christian, raised to demonize other religions, all sorts of things. And when I got to college, I was committed to unlearning that and like exploring other things. And so then in order to do that, I had to commit myself to showing up in other places. And that's what I would say is the first step. Like, actually just commit to showing up in places where you know you're going to hear things that are going to make you really uncomfortable, where you're going to hear things that you are going to need to question your own values, your own practices, and your beliefs, and go into it with that assumption and with the openness to do that. And then be really intentional about building relationships with people who are in the communities with which you want to be allies. Right. So if I say that I want to be an ally to, as a Christian, I want to be allies to Muslims, then how I do that means that I understand Ramadan, that I'm learning about fasting, right? And that I'm being intentional in that practice and thoughtful, as opposed to saying, look at me, I'm an ally.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on something. I want to go to this question for both of you because I think it turns the conversation in a way that you just led us. The question is, in what ways can allyship be framed as a form of collective empowerment rather than reliance on external support? Because I think even the way I've thought about it, and I think about allyship is like, well, we need you. We need something from you. We need you to leverage your privilege so that we can do something. But how do we change the conversation from that to being just about our collective, collaborative empowerment, as a humanity? Is that something that you think could help reframe how people think about it?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just offer one quick response and then I'll pass the mic because first of all, I just want to say I love Dr. Love, soon to
Oh,
be my
yeah, sure.
you know
Oh
how I
yeah,
feel. My
yeah, I love that. Yeah,
love
I love
Dr.
that
Love.
book.
Love her, love her, love her, love her. Highly recommend. The only thing I wanted to say is that I think it is an intent. I think it's a disposition and a frame of thinking. So if I enter into relationships with others with a frame of thinking that my liberation is tied up in yours, that I actually fundamentally cannot be free unless you are, then that means I'm going to enter into the conversation differently. So
Absolutely.
that's just the part I want to offer.
Right.
Marissa?
I'm thinking about the lens of work, right? And so most of my work is centered around, going to organizations that have these outward flying flags of racial equity, right? But their internal operating norms, I'm going to use this very technical term, is trash, right? And so, like, how do you help to close that gap? And so, how do you create allyships within organizations? And also, how do you create that trust? Right. And so organizations, have to provide an opportunity for, folks to have a lens and to share their lens and how they're experiencing the work environment. Right. And then, what is the power analysis in that work environment? Oftentimes, I work with folks, we do these, surveys, we do these climate surveys with a racial equity lens. And then we, come back per department and we start redlining areas of what we consider disparities. And it really kind of calls out, how power and inclusion shows up within those organizational norms, right? And so before we can move forward with all the values-based stuff, organizations have to provide a platform, if you will, for people, to share their experience and their perspectives, in a safe way, as much as safe as it can be. Because oftentimes, it's a bloodbath in organizations when we start unpacking that stuff, which for people of color that have held that stuff for many years, because it's just, we're going to stay safe, I'm going to keep this job, right? It's an opportunity for them to heal. Right. And also it's an opportunity for people to, to move beyond the performative stuff. And, as Dr. Love says, and, how do you show up as a co-conspirator at work, helping people? At the end of the day, are people getting promoted? Right? How are you supporting the development of somebody? Are you mentoring that person, in the workplace? As Dr. Love says, how are you, going to replenish your ATM machine, if you will, that you have in terms of privilege as a white person. So I think in the context of work, right, in terms of in the workplace, it's important for organizational leaders to really, come clean about what their perspective is. I know that there's been a lot of cuts and there's a lot of, political frameworks around, how racial equity and diversity and inclusion is playing out right now. And so, the people that may have been our allies in this space, may feel like, oh, this is a time, for us to be backing up. But I also, at the end of the day, I feel like organizations really need to help people to navigate the power dynamics that exist within their work climate.
Absolutely. And that's really the intention of this webinar series, to help people to navigate those dynamics. But I also think it's important for us to discuss whether or not we really can be successful within the structure, right? Like, so when we're talking about the, the opposite of allyship showing up as self-reliance, do we have the capability to succeed in these workspaces and in other spaces without allyship? I have an opinion, but I'm very much interested in you all's, and I'm sure you can change my little feeble opinion very easily. But I'm very interested in understanding because there's some people, and we see mass exodus from workplaces, right? We see more entrepreneurship. We're seeing people who can't exist authentically in spaces, and so they're moving out to do their own things because, but for those of us who are navigating careers in workplaces where the power dynamics don't belong to us, is there any way to navigate them on our own accord without allyship from our counterparts?
I'll say again, it's important for us to be able to navigate the culture, identify it, and navigate it, the culture of the organization or whatever that systematic thing is, and racism and how it shows up in those spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important for us to learn the game, learn the rules, and make decisions accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that people need to I don't think that anybody should choose to be a martyr, right? Like if it's not serving you, Nina Simone said, get up, right? Get up from the table that's no longer serving you. And so I support that and I respect that. I also, again, just kind of going back to fundamentally how most communities of color just exist in the world. We exist in such a way that we all got to eat. And I'm going to make sure you eat when I eat. And if that's the case, then for me, self-reliance is actually not even what we should be aiming for. Self-reliance feels like a Western framework that we should actually decolonize ourselves from and push back against, and that we should actually seek after a space that is more communal, that is more reliant on shared accountability, that is more protective, more loving, is what I think. I think that requires everybody to think that. And not everybody thinks that. And so I acknowledge that that is complicated. And I will say that, in full transparency, let me choose my words. In full transparency, doing DEI and higher ed is hard today.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard today.
Mm-hmm.
Today was hard.
Always been hard though.
Right? It's been hard. That's my point. It's been hard forever.
It's been hard forever.
And it's still hard
it will
today,
shred
right?
you.
And so I guess I say that to say, I often think about leaving. I do, right? I often think about making a different choice. And then I think to myself, like, somebody didn't leave, right? Somebody else didn't leave so that I could be doing this. Somebody else was decided to make sacrifices so that they could be a model for me, so that they could be a possibility model, so that they could be a trailblazer. Somebody took the hits. Some days I'm sick of taking hits. And I also think that perhaps I'm in this position because I'm well designed to take the hits that someone else can't, or that perhaps some of the privileges I have developed over time position me to leverage my privilege in a way that requires me to be in front of others so that they don't have to take the hits. And so that's another reason why I think co-conspirators, accomplices, even allyship is so important. I'm thinking about some images from several years ago that happened in Egypt when they were trying to overthrow a violent dictator, and Muslims were praying and Muslims were getting attacked. And Christians from Egypt and from other neighboring countries came and surrounded them and said, like, we will sacrifice our bodies so that you can pray. Mm-hmm. And like, when you have privilege and you acknowledge that role to take the hits, then I think that that's why it's important. And I don't think self-reliance allows us to have someone surrounding us so that we can pray, right? Yeah, so I think it's necessary. And I think we need to figure out how to recultivate environments that lead to trust, lead to love, lead to open communication, lead to sacrifices on behalf of each other. Otherwise, I actually don't know that we're going to get to I don't know that we'll see a world in 20 years if we don't do that. Like, I just don't actually know.
Can I raise something
Sure.
that you talked about in terms of taking the hit? Now, myself personally, I've worked in the academy for many, many years, and I worked at
Mm-hmm.
the, where racism is embedded in the policies. I worked at,
Sure is.
University Human Resources for College Park, University of Maryland. And, I had a lot of allies around me when the doors were shut. Marissa, calling that out was just so good, But at the end of the day, I was starting to have anxiety attacks because
Mm-hmm.
instead of them using my higher order skills to do the work, I was told that, 500 resumes came in, mine was at the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I'm heavily skilled and heavily resourced in this area. But when I started calling out practices that undermine, the development of my people, right? Instead of them using my higher order skills, they sought to dismantle my inner authority, right?
Sure.
So this really became about my agency. And,
Mm-hmm.
I took the hit for many years because in the spirit of, I have to do this for my people. Well, I ended up leaving there and creating the Living Well Center for Social and Economic Vibrancy. And that was one of the painful problems that, got me there. And so as I'm going, I've worked for a national funder as an auditor and going, around organizations. And one of the things that, I think that we have to recognize is that, we have to have healing in this work. I
Absolutely.
cannot tell you enough about, I'm invited to these diversity forums, and I always say, you got to do a track around healing because I have people calling me, having anxiety attacks, right? They're being shredded in these environments under the auspices of DEI, right? They're typically people not like you or myself that were trained in this area and have a footprint. These are people that were promoted in a position that became available because this is the new thing, right? And so these people, and I'm saying these people because they call me and they're in tears and they're looking for, some type of support and some way of navigating something that is very ambiguous, right? These companies don't know what they need and want. They don't like it's like literally they threw a paper towel at the wall. And so we have to be mindful of taking the hit. Like
Mm-hmm.
I took the hit for years, at Maryland because, I saw that FM, facilities management, who had the most personnel on a campus like College Park, the only way they could come to training is that they did not meet expectations on their performance review. Okay. And so I became their advocate. And so I was literally fighting a system, that was set on, personnel apartheid is what I call it. Right. And so I was taking the hit, but I was also taking the hit, having anxiety attacks, right? Crying, just, trying to fight. And I had all these allies when they would come in and shut the door, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were
Behind the
great
scenes.
allies then.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
respond to that really quickly?
Sure.
Yes, 1000%. And so absolutely again, like if you need to get up from the table, then for the people watching the playback, if you need to get up from the table, do that, do that. And then I also wanted to amplify what you said about healing. Absolutely true. I think often about like, which again, going to this conversation around allyship, co-conspiratorship, all of this stuff, like I think also fundamentally we have different work to do, right? I think about dismantling systems of racism, to be completely honest with you, like even though that's like literally my job, equity and inclusive excellence, I don't actually think my job is dismantling systems of racism. I didn't create that. My job, is actually to heal my racialized trauma that I have been living in daily since I entered this world as I'm bumping up against systems of racialized oppression, and to create spaces of healing, radical love, and reparation and restoration for our communities. And then it is somebody else's job, people, in particular, white people with power and privilege, because we know there are some white folks who don't have power or privilege, right? Depending on their lived circumstances and experiences. I think it's their job. And so in the workplace, that's also how I think about allyship and co-conspiratorship. Like, actually, I'm about to be quiet on that. That's
Let
your
you lead.
that's
Yeah.
yours to say something about this time, because I'm not doing it. I'm not expending my energy in that way because I'm expending my energy protecting myself right now, right? And I am seeing some of my colleagues do that even in real time this week, even today, you know? And I think that that's important, that some of the ways that we show up is to armor up ourselves and let a different ally do the work of the day.
So I just want to answer a question that's in the chat, and then we're going to go into some specifics. But the question is, what are the key differences between allyship and DEI? And so I would even proffer, should allyship always be a part of DEI in a workplace? How would you all respond to that question?
Yeah, but I think that is something that is not necessarily articulated, if you will. It's not a policy, right? It's a value system. It is a cultural norm.
Character,
It is,
yeah.
right. It's a part of the institutional culture, right? To make sure that there's room for that, if you will.
Yeah, I think I would answer slightly differently, and to say, because part of what's happening for me is I want to respond and say, well, what is DEI? Right. And so if we mean DEI as the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, then I would think of allyship as a concept. In the same ways that diversity is a concept, allyship is a concept, inclusion is a concept. And so I would think of it in that way. I think that you can talk about allyship. You probably can't talk about allyship without talking about diversity, equity, or inclusion. I think you can probably talk about diversity, equity, or inclusion without talking about allyship. You probably can talk about diversity, equity, or inclusion without talking about one of those other two words too, right? Like, and so I think, and I'm feeling particularly a call to that, I think, because I'm in response to the global anti-DEI attacks, people are making DEI, like not even diversity, equity, and inclusion, but just like DEI as a big neon sign. They're making DEI the container of all things bad. And I do think it's helpful when we say, wait a minute, well, what is DEI? It's literally diversity, comma, equity, comma, and inclusion. And we don't fight against those things. You know what I mean? And so I just wanted to offer that too.
So I want to ask this question because we want to be very intentional and specific tonight. We want to talk about the specific actions that allies, right, like non-Black allies, can take to support Black professionals in the workplace. And this is so that we can call them out for allies watching, so that they can start to, like, these specific focus areas can resonate with them, but also so that Black professionals can know what allyship really, really looks like, right? Because I think we can also mistake it sometimes for, we talk about being decent and being nice is not the same as allyship, right? Like, and you will have people refer to themselves as functioning in allyship who might not really be doing that. So as we break down the list, what are some specific things in a workplace that a white or non-Black ally can do to support a Black professional? What does it look like specifically?
I want to start with saying that, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. This is not about, your comfort level, right? This is about, creating trust in a relationship where people can be authentic, right? And people can not so much call people out, but call people in. I think about, I was doing some race equity work in Maine, and there was a white executive that works for a CAP organization. He was saying to me that, most of the population in that area was refugees from Ethiopia and poor whites. And he said, we can't keep, the populations of Ethiopians working in the organization. Like, he was like, I don't know what to do. He said, but I try to, when I'm in meetings, I bring that demographic that we serve along. And he said, and I sit and I be quiet. I'm quiet. He said, and I tell them, we want to hear your voice, and we make room for that voice. And so I said to him, I said, that's great. At this, juncture, you're actually, doing a transaction that is providing an opportunity for agency for that individual or that community.
Yeah, a couple of things that I wrote down here. Some of the most powerful in the workplace in particular, some of the most powerful forms of allyship I have experienced is the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting, where someone is inviting me into the behind the scenes context that I need to be successful, and then is debriefing with me after the fact. And that is a practice that I have taken with me since early in my career as a model of allyship to others. It in particular because I often tend to be younger in relationship to my peers. And so them being able to tell me like how to recommendations on how to move, how to show up, that kind of a thing, but also empowering me to say, and also you still get a choice in that and mattered. The other thing that I have found really meaningful in experiences with me is for people to be curious about my perspective, about my background. So even in the story that was just shared about Ethiopian community members, right? Like in the same ways, people giving me space to say, or even being in meetings and saying, Jasmine, it looked like you had something to offer. Jasmine, did you want to add something? Right? Like that is meaningful, especially in spaces where if I tend to be, and I'm so thankful to God right now that I'm not in this circumstance, but in the past I have been in circumstances where I am literally the only young Black woman in the room. And so certainly people are not, you know, prioritizing my voice. And so for my colleagues with privilege to say, it looks like Jasmine wants to say something is meaningful and helpful. And then the other way that I have seen allyship in particular, it's really not allyship, it's modeling, but I'm just going to offer it in this conversation of allyship, is that I once had a colleague who became my boss, who was a Black woman. And ironically, she was from Philly, and she showed up like some, I don't know if you've met people from Philly, but they like move in a particular way. And she showed up in Michigan State like 1000% herself in every single conversation all the time. And I watch people get uncomfortable. I watch people be inspired. I watch people be in awe. And I mean, I just ate it all up, you know? And so I also think like there is a practice of allyship that is literally you demanding your own authenticity. And when we do that for ourselves, we create space and give people the permission to do the same, even when they don't know it. Like, I don't know that I told her that for maybe 3 years, you know, but for 3 years, she was showing up, knocking down doors for me in ways that she didn't even recognize. And so I think that there is some power in modeling. If you have found yourself as a Black person in a position of power, privilege, and leadership, then how you leverage your power, privilege, and leadership in those spaces matters.
Matters, right. And also, and we've talked about this before in this series, not passing down kind of like the bad advice and the things that we've been conditioned to believe about how we have to show up, right? Like passing that down to people that you mentor, because that's the way it's all, you know, you learned it and it's always been done. Even if it didn't serve you, we tend to still pass those things down. So I love that you all shared that. I'm going to ask those who are watching to make sure you give us some of your examples in the chat, and make sure you ask any questions that you have of the panelists into the chat as well. Let's talk about lived experience. So you've given a number of different examples, but if you have any others at this point, it would be great to share those now. Most people know I've built most of my career in non-Black spaces. I've frequently been the only Black person, specifically only Black woman in the room, and have had to navigate that. And I think the way I would have looked at allyship prior to kind of maturing in the work is that, like, if you're an ally, you're going to have to speak out for me, right? Like, you can't sit here and see me being harmed and then talk to me in the parking lot or at the meeting after the meeting or later. Like, you know, if you see me being harmed, I need you to address it. And I don't know that that's always the thing to look for now as I navigate like these conversations and think about the different ways that people can put you forward and show up, you know, for you, and can strategize with you to get to the points that you want to get to. But I know in the past that has been my concept of allyship. And so there were probably situations in my lived experience where I had allyship, but didn't believe I did because it didn't show up the way I expected it to show up. What are your lived experience that you can share tonight?
I have something that that I think about oftentimes. When I worked for a national funder, you know, we had underwriting meetings, and I had my white male colleagues making jokes about, you know, the Black-led organizations, right? And they would make these little jokes. And, you know, after the meeting, you know, I would go, you know, in their office and I would say, I need you to stop doing that. You know, even though it's a little joke, you know, it's going to impact when it comes time to underwriting that organization. It's going to show up there, right? Your little jokes about this organization being Black-led, it's going to show up there. And so sometimes you have to be brave, and let people know that, I know you probably didn't mean any harm, but this is creating harm, right? This is creating an attitude of harm, which at the end of the day, is going to show up in the underwriting for this organization. So, we've got to, be brave sometimes and call people in, not so much call them out, and ask them, to be a support, if you will, or a resource for that entity or that, individual, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can think of two examples of really powerful allyship that I feel like I've experienced early in my career. Again, I was working at Michigan State. I had recently got accepted into a PhD program. And I was getting ready essentially to quit my job so that I could go to school full time. And the dean, assistant dean at the time, she was a little like she was real little. She was a little white lady, older. And she came down to my office one day and was like, so Jeff, who was my boss, Jeff told me you're thinking about quitting so you can go to school full time. And I said, yeah, that's what feels like it's the best choice. I'm going to get a scholarship, I'm going to get a graduate assistantship, this and that. And she said, well, let me talk to you about some things that other people do. And I said, okay, let's talk about it. By the end of that conversation, I had my entire school paid for. She had restructured her entire budget to pay for me to go to school while working full time. I got a full day off work once a week for 4 years so that I could go to school full time. And that did not change me getting paid for 40 hours, even though I wasn't working 40 hours. I got research overload pay so that they could make up the difference in my salary. Like all sorts of
All the
wide,
things. Yeah.
but I did not know 30 minutes before the conversation started. Right. And I mean, so then 4 years later, I went to school, I worked full time, like all of this stuff, all because she said, well, let me tell you the things that other people do. Right. Like, let me actually invite you behind the scenes here. Let me show you how the sausage is made. And I don't even eat meat. And so that was masterful and meaningful, right? And now I have become the same person. Oh, did you know you can ask for this, do this thing, that thing? So I thought that was really meaningful. This other example is actually, I don't know if it's an example of allyship or if it's actually an example of being a good supervisor. But I'm going to name it as allyship because we had racial differences and she could have chosen to show up differently than she did. But my previous boss, just before I came to where I'm at now, I don't think ever left a conversation with me without something that she was going to tell the president that I did that she was proud of.
Mm-hmm.
And that was bi-weekly. And so at this institution, with 1,000 employees, 13,000 students, the president literally knew who I was and the work that I did because my boss was committed to saying something about me in every conversation with him. And I just don't know like how my career could have catapulted the way that it did at UMBC without her doing that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think I do good work, so I'm not gonna poo-poo on myself. Like, good job, Jasmine. But your name enters spaces that you don't ever usually
Yes.
go into. And so the fact that she was carrying my name in intentional ways and then was asking me, what do you want me to say when I say your name? Is also a practice that I have since adopted because it is that masterful. It's just masterful, right? It's sponsorship at its finest.
At its
And so
finest.
I think those are two really good examples of allyship. And the reason that I want to absolutely name that they were both white women is because I know oftentimes how white women show up as nice and not allies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important to also call out when they do it
Especially.
right,
Yes.
right?
I have a lot of opportunities that have been created by allies. So people who may even make room for me to come in and present, do workshops, facilitations, and these kind of things, and give me the space, the safe space to say what needs to be said. And I really appreciate that allyship in my current role. And it happens all the time across all types of people. And I think that's one way that people have certainly shown up for me. Let's talk about how we can create corporate culture, community culture, societal culture where allyship of Black professionals and Black people is just something that is a thing. Like, what those things look like. Um, one of the things that came up in the research is that resources are involved in, corporate settings that really want to promote allyship, right? Like really want to invest in teaching people about it, making room and time and space for the relationship building around it and the understanding and cultural engagement. Sometimes that will you know, um, pave the way for true allyship. What do we think about corporations doing this work, this DEI work? Everybody, wants to put a claim on the fact that they're engaging in it, but that don't allocate resources to this. And how could resources lead to better allyship in workplaces?
Hmm.
Because there's not a you. If there was a Marissa, if there was a Jasmine in every workplace, there could be a quick and easy understanding of what this is, why it's necessary, and all of these things. But that requires resources.
Mm-hmm. I think that we're starting to see, corporations, such as like example, Under Armour, right? Under Armour is a profit entity with a social mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, these corporations are starting to understand better that you have to have a real authentic relationship with community, in a way that is not performative, in a way that, you're sending resources, into these communities. I feel like, working in the nonprofit sector for 100 years, I often feel very frustrated. And I say that, the nonprofit model as we know it is outliving its utility, right?
Mm.
The future organization will operate as open teams of teams with a symbiotic relationship working towards a common mission and purpose, right? And so corporations are going to have to do a better job of looking at their service areas, who they're hiring, how are they going to create, opportunity and resources in those communities that they're serving. I think it's really important for, corporations to, do the modeling. Like you said, I had the same experience where when I first started working at Maryland on the education side of the house, doing systems change work, my director looked me in my face in a meeting and said, listen, like we didn't hire you to sit there and not say anything. Like I can tell, I can look at you and say that you have a voice about something. So, to the point, given permission, right? To do that. I think that, we have to kind of reframe, how we are in relationship with these companies. And also, hold these companies, feet to the fire around like, what is your, data equity policy look like, right? Like what, what are you doing with data, right? What's the narrative, do you have a data DEI culture, if you will? And I think that it really starts with, corp companies, taking a hard look at themselves, how is the institution, operating, what are the policies, what are the protocols, what are the norms there that are going to help move people forward, right? Again, equity shows up in our pockets, right? How are we looking at, data around pay and promotion and training, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. I love this question in the chat because it's something I often think about. And I think I listed it earlier and maybe didn't articulate it as well as it's here. But, allyship, is it about the cause or is it about individual people, right? And so if there's an ally that's interested in me uniquely, right, does that allyship automatically, is it expected to extend to Marissa and Jasmine as well, right? Because you are lifting your allyship for Black community, or, is it just an individual thing, which sounds a little different to me? Like, do allies pick up allyship for all?
Well, for me, my understanding of allyship, okay, well, let me back up. I think people can practice or engage in allyship behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of whether or not they are an actual ally.
Mm-hmm.
So let me say that, right? Like a bunch of people probably donated in 2020 to a billion racial equity clauses and never thought about it again. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say they were allies, but they definitely
Did something great.
engaged in the allyship behavior at the time. The other thing about allyship, my understanding and how I would answer this question is that I actually don't get to decide that I'm an ally. So it doesn't even matter. Like the community actually decides. And so do allies need to be allies for all? For example, an ally for you as a Black woman, are they allies to all Black women? I think that I would decide that in community with other Black women as
Mm-hmm.
I watch them show up or not show up for my other Black women colleagues, which I have seen or not seen
Mm-hmm.
at other, in other workplace spaces. So that to me, you know, I think is the difference. I don't know that you can be an ally to an individual person based on an identity and not engage in allyship behaviors or be thinking progressive and liberating thoughts about that community writ large. Like, I would not claim you as an ally then. I would think that you sometimes feel
Drawn.
convicted
Yeah.
to do the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about listening because that's such a incredible piece about, you know, as far as like reframing corporate culture, but also thinking about allyship and making room for it. It's like this active listening. And one of the things I came across in a setting, an event I attended about a month ago, was a gentleman who sat on the panel, and I'll talk about this till forever, and literally said out of his mouth, with a room probably that was about 60% Black, that we're tired of talking about these things that have happened in the past. We've moved on. Life is better. These things don't happen anymore. We all know what has happened in the past to harm, you know, the racism, but, you know, it's a new day, a new world. Everybody's free, equal. You know, that was the sentiment of his remarks. And it made me think that perhaps because we don't want to talk about racism, we don't know how to talk about racism, you know, that racism as a conversation and a concept is just not in the forefront the way it needs to be, so that people will understand the call for allyship or the need for, you know, continued advocacy, right? Like, it's a thing that happened in 2020, but we got past that and we've moved on and people did good things and now we're here. And so
And we
I've
had a
been,
Black president too.
and we had a Black president, you know, got Black governor. And so I have been toying around at ABC with this whole concept of my realities with racism, because I honestly don't think that we talk about it enough, right? Like, and I talk to people all the time about how, like, I can't think of a day that I don't feel it, sense it, you know, observe it. But I don't know that we put it in the forefront and we don't necessarily give potential allies something to hear and listen to be informed. So where does listening fall in to allyship, and how responsible are we to really, you know, communicate our harm in ways that people understand that it is still very relevant?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think about, I do these trainings, they're national, I do, you know, this race literacy work. Um, and, you know, I don't like, I work with the organization. I don't necessarily know them, you know, so to speak. So when the Zoom opens, you know, there's times when the Trump rally, you know, no offense, is like looking at me and I'm looking at them, right? And you know, and I start off by, and I can be a little provocative, you know, by saying I'm not here to fly any gang flags, red or blue. You know, I'm here for the protection and the promotion of my people. And you could see, you know, the people of color, the Black people, like you could tell that they're texting each other, like, did she just go here?
Yeah.
Right. I think that you know, to the point about, you know, listening, right? You know, I really try to create, you know, breakout spaces for people to articulate how they experience these terms, right? And typically when you do that, you know, people will come out, you know, come back from the breakout, and they've unpacked stuff that happened 10 years ago that just never came up as appropriate in the work environment, because, you know, we're supposed to be really talking about race, right? And it gave, you know, the white people that were there for the experience a whole nother point of view, right? And so we've got to create spaces for people that don't necessarily experience racism like we do, you know, to talk about how these terms and concepts impact them financially, socially, right? Spiritually, you know, and mentally.
Jasmine, any thoughts? You look really contemplative.
I'm thinking, I'm thinking, I'm thinking because I'm having a hard time with this question. Why am I having a hard time with this question? Because you not only asked about the listening part, but you also asked about like our responsibility
Mhm.
to tell our story. That's the part I'm struggling with. Why am I struggling with that? I'm struggling with it because I think it's my responsibility to tell my story.
Okay.
That I think it is my responsibility to share the lived narratives that I have had as it relates to racism or other systems of oppression. I also recognize that what we experience as Black people is racial trauma. And so
Mhm.
to ask people to re-traumatize themselves over and over and tell them it's their responsibility, I'm having a hard time with that. And I don't like to get into the arguments about emotional labor, which is partly why I'm having a hard time, because I would say, well, to my peers, well, we decided to be educators, so we committed to the work of of emotional labor. So like we don't get to opt out, is my thinking. If that's not the commitment that you've made with your life or your life's work, then I don't know that it's your responsibility. And I think maybe you do get to opt out because it's traumatic and it is exhausting. And it's exhausting across generations, right? Like there are stories that our grandparents haven't told us and won't ever tell us about seeing somebody be lynched or whatever else, because it's literally traumatic. They can't even, it's like caught in their throat, And so that's the part that I'm struggling with. And so I don't have an answer to that part of the question. The part about listening, though, I do think that it's necessary. And I would say that it's important to listen to others, kind of in what Marissa shared about how we have experiences, the language we're using, and all of that kind of stuff. I would also say be listening to yourself. Like, I think, we talk often in some of my spaces about microaggressions and the impact of microaggressions and why people shouldn't be doing microaggressions, which are these like subtle little slights that communicate racism and other forms of othering, right? But people don't ever talk about the thing that precedes the microaggressions, because the microaggression is a behavior. The biases that we carry are what preceded. And so I like when you listen to yourself, you can unpack the biases that will then stop you from being ignorant in your behaviors if you're intentional and careful and thoughtful.
Really, yes.
And so I do think that the listening is important. And I would say don't only be listening to other people, also be listening to yourself. Let me also add one piece about that, in particular for white allies. We often talk about issues of racism like this, like it benefits people of color, it impacts people of color. Oh, us white people, we don't really have a role in this conversation. When in actuality, 100% of us are having racialized experiences every single day. Some of us are having racialized experiences that connect to systems of privilege. Some of us are having racialized experiences that connect to systems of oppression, but we're all having them. And so also when you listen to yourself and listen to others, then you also begin to situate yourself in how you're having experiences that are different from other people, so that you can get to a space of awareness about how perhaps that's because you are connected to systems of privilege in ways that other people are not. But if you are only ever focused on what they have or don't have and are never situating your own self, then you actually won't be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to interpret this question in the chat to ask, in allyship, in true allyship, are you able to be authentic, like truly authentic, or is there still kind of like a pressure because they're still who they are, right, to show up in ways that are more, perceivably acceptable?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't professionally code switch anymore. Like
Okay.
it's exhausting, right, to do
Yeah.
that. And I think that, when I walk into a space, that we're having this conversation that really can create what I call corporate whitewater. For white people, they get like, oh my God, we're going to have this uncomfortable conversation. And Black people, to your point, they're often re-traumatized by the experience. But I find that to the point of listening, them sharing their stories, not so much for them re-traumatizing. They're like, Marissa, thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell this white boy what he did and how it impacted me, even though it was 8 years ago, right? And so that's the healing piece, of this work. I just think that it's important for, folks to listen in a way that, we always say that, don't take anything personal. I used to use the four agreements,
Four agreements.
right?
Yeah.
So now I think I've shifted it a bit, right? Because, for us to say not to take anything personal, like this is not personal, where it is, right? You talk about listening to yourself, right? Sometimes it is personal, right? And I do feel a way about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Well, I want to hear about your code switching, or if because Marissa was like, she went 10 toes down. She was like, I don't do it anymore.
yeah.
I was waiting on you to start there.
Yeah, well, because it's hard. Again, it's hard for me to answer this question. I don't code switch either. In some ways, because I have like generational language, lexicon, slang, there is some like translating is what I describe it. And so, sometimes I'm in doing professional presentations and I might say slay, whatever. And I might say, that is to say, whatever, whatever.
It'll clear it up. Yeah.
So
Because you're an educator too.
I might do a little bit of that. The reason I'm having a hard time answering this question is because I don't know that I ever existed in a way that would require code switching either, right? Like how I sound right now is how I've always sounded. When I was in 6th grade, my mom dressed me like a 40-year-old worker. Like I had on a suit and shoulder pads, right? So they were making fun of me. I was prepared for corporate America. Like I was
Already.
prepared for this world. And so I don't know that I have needed to code switch. My colleagues who are Black women from Louisville, Kentucky, who speak with a deep Southern drawl, do feel like they need to code switch. My colleagues who wear really long dramatic nails or colorful hair do feel pressure in my Midwestern home conservative states to show up in particular ways. And then I will say that I once got encouragement to code switch from a Black man who was my supervisor for 2 years. And at like a year and a half in, he says to me, Jasmine, I see, this was literally my very first job in higher ed. Jasmine, I see an administrator in you. I see you as a high level, higher education leader, And he goes, and if you want people to take you seriously, I need you to dress more professionally. And
That's
I said,
infused. It's infused.
well, what do you mean, Dr. Jackson? And he and he said, well, you might think about wearing a suit, this and that, this and that. He's like, look at me, look at me.
How well
And
I'm doing.
my shoulder pads and like brown tie and all this kind of stuff. And he was very loving and supportive. But I showed up that next day in a brown pinstripe suit. It was horrible. And it literally had shoulder pads. And it didn't even fit well. And anybody, I mean, you can look behind me and kind of have a sense, like, I'm not wearing a brown pinstripe suit anywhere, right? Like pink is a thing that is a part of my identity. Yeah. And I showed up the next day defeated. I lacked confidence. I felt so deeply uncomfortable. I was like shifting in my clothes all day. I literally spoke less than I had spoken prior to that in a year and a half. And I noticed the difference in that day. And the next day I showed up in my regular clothes again. Because I said if that is what is expected of me, then that I can't do. And if that's what's expected of me to become this administrator in the future or whatever, then I actually just need to keep working at Ruby Tuesday, which is what I was doing at the time, being a waitress. Because I could not see myself fitting into a mold that specific. And so, yeah, so since then, I don't code switch in my language or in my attire. I also changed my hair up a lot, actually, quite a bit. And I think that that's okay and appropriate. And when I'm working with young Black women in particular, who I'm working closely with, one who I'm really proud of, who I left back at UMBC, we talk often about like, you need to know the rules and you need to know you have choices. Mm-hmm. And so like, make the choices that are aligned with you. And if those choices don't fit the rules of this institution, I will help you find someplace else to be.
Can I also share that, I think about this whole identity code switching, right? Which, my crew calls respectability. And, I work with a lot of, on the ground change maker advocates. Nika Namdi is one of my thought leaders in Sister Love. And, she has this thing where it used to drive me crazy. Like, why are you wearing a graphic tee?
There's a point. Yes.
And she's like, don't make me come for your life, right? Mm-hmm. And she does it on purpose. Like yes. She literally is very intentional. So when she's doing, press conferences, she'll say, she'll have on a t-shirt that may say Black women don't owe you S, right? Mm-hmm. And then she'll say, oh no, they're not going to have.
I gotta where that t-shirt at? Let me write that down now.
They're not going to have the camera, right? And so it really kind of helped me because, I'm old school. I'm like, baby boomer adjacent, right? I come from the place of, you wear your structured clothing. I have my power suits, back in the day, I was an Ellen Tracy, Dana Buckman girl with my Stuart Weitzman shoes. Like I had all of that going on, right? So you wasn't going to judge me because my hair was nappy, back in the day. But, what Nika and the folks that work on the Living Well platform have taught me a lot about, like you need to relearn some of your stuff, right? And, Diane Bell McCoy, I never forget, the first time, when she said, I need to unpack my stripes of white supremacy. my own stripes of white supremacy, which was very powerful for me because I was leading a community organization that I come from these, university, power positions, right? And, I was bringing that like ideology, like when we come to a meeting, you, sir, you should not have that on and y'all should be wearing this, right? But, people, when we show up, they care less about what people have on and, are very, impressed for a lack of a better word, with their observations and how they are checking the systems, right? And so they become, to your point about, we get allies based on our work, not necessarily our personalities, because, we're known to be, little
I also think that that type of a decision is so important too, because it's also about like, who am I here for? The people
right.
I'm like the people I'm here for knew that I was gonna have on a graphic tee.
Yes.
That's why I wore it. You know what I mean? Like that's why I'm not here for these other people. I'm not talking to these other people. And even like, for example, at my job, because I work with students, when I am working with students, I show up differently because I
Yes.
want to enter into their space in a way that I am more comfortable and in a way that honors how they enter into spaces as well. And so if I show up in a three-piece suit, again, in shoulder pads, apparently I have a thing against shoulder pads, my three-piece suit and the shoulder pads, and the students have on jeans and tennis shoes, then we're already power dynamically off, right? And so part of it is also just bringing us into the same level playing field for communication.
In relationship building. We do that as well when we go out for our community convo events. And so we're very intentional of showing up looking like regular Black people so that we can be, we can lean on our membership in the community and level the playing field for the communication. This has been so enlightening and so enjoyable. And I'm so sad to see it coming to a close. But what I would like to do is give you both an opportunity to just give some closing remarks around cultivating allyship, why it's important, what are the steps we can take, how we should be framing this conversation, how we can all be advocates for the conversation, and would love you all to offer that up to those who are viewing tonight. And we can start with Marissa.
I would just like to start with framing from a analogy or analysis that we do, how we analyze a organization's culture, if you will. And so we look at, what is operating from a intrapersonal perspective. How does this thing impact my self-worth, my self-esteem, my self-concept? Intrapersonal. How is what I'm experiencing in this environment impact my relationship with others, right? How does this thing that's operating within the culture, how does the institution itself, reinforce these norms of, power dynamics, et cetera. And then finally, systemic, right? What are the policies and the practices that reinforce norms? And so when we look at those pillars, if you will, and unpack them, it helps, I think, to build allyship because people are not looking at, a physical or a social reality, from just their lens. So that's what I believe. Yes.
That's amazing. All right, Jasmine.
So can I drop a link in the chat to
You can
share?
do all the things you'd like to do and share as much as we absolutely want to leave people with resources.
So I
Oh,
mentioned,
wait, I'm going to put it, you want it for everyone, right? I'll do it.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, oh, that was just sent to the host and the panelists. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you.
I'll get it done.
So what I just shared was a link to, I mentioned that quote earlier from Beverly Tatum, and I got it from a talk and interview that Brittany Packett did, where she talked about allyship, accomplice, being an ally, accomplice, or a co-conspirator. And so I wanted to just share that with folks to take a listen in their own free time. It's not a very long video at all, and I think it's good fodder for continuing this conversation. I think the only couple of things that I might offer are a bunch of quotes. So one, again, or a reminder, paraphrase of a quote, that our liberation is tied in each other. And so behaving in ways that are in allyship or co-conspiratorship, I think, is a necessity for a liberated future for all of us. And so it has to be about more than just being nice. The other thing that I wanted to offer is this quote by Dr. Breedlove, who says, systems do not perpetuate themselves. They are perpetuated by the action or inaction of people who act automatically. on the basis of their socialization or kind of the indoctrination of their lived experiences. I think the point that really matters is that systems are perpetuated by the inaction or inaction of us individuals. And so every single day we have a choice point, and we can choose to pull our collective community closer to humanity and liberation, or we can choose not to do that. And so I'm just inviting us into the choice, and want to remind us that the choice is ours, each individually, because of the ways that we each individually show up in this world and impact the systems that are perpetuated around us. So I guess I would just invite us all into action, into active engagement. I would invite us all into allyship, and I would be taking seriously the ways that you have privilege and be thinking about how you can leverage your privilege in the name of someone else.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise, your insights, for talking about things that are difficult to talk about, but leaning in so that other people can follow your lead. We appreciate you so much at Associated Black Charities. And we appreciate all of you who have joined us tonight, and all of you who will watch the playback. And I will invite each of you to join us next month, which will be in May, where our Equity at Work webinar will be about addressing racial trauma in the workplace. So now we're talking about addressing it. We coming in hot, y'all, these workplaces. Like we fed up. Addressing racial trauma in the workplace. For Associated Black Charities, I am Chrissy Thornton. Good night.